From the time people begin to notice symptoms of dementia, transitions begin to occur. The first involves psychological and social adaptations. This begins with a person with dementia, but their family, friends, and other people who are important to them will experience psychological and social transitions as well. As a disease progresses, changes are also required in their physical environments. This can include home modifications, dealing with driving, getting help at home. People with dementia have a higher likelihood than their age peers to be hospitalized. And finally, many people with dementia transition to a residential setting, including adult care homes, assisted living, residential care facilities, or nursing facilities. As discussed in the Tier 1 modules, many people with dementia experience challenges to their identity as they experience losses that no longer allow them to do many of the things that provided them with a sense of who they were. Recall how individuals with dementia experience stigma and loss of personhood. A major psychological transition, then, is to have an identity as a person living with dementia. Remember how in Module 6, Sarah felt invisible, marginalized, set apart from everyone she cared about and everything that was meaningful to her. As the disease progresses, the psychological transitions continue. Not only does the person have a progressive disease, but they assume a role as a person with dementia who increasingly needs support and supervision. Sarah told her husband that she was capable of making herself some tea without burning the house down. That will change, and with that change, Sarah will experience another loss of competence for her daily living and her ability to manage her daily routines. You might remember from Module 6 that Bill was haunted by the memory of his mother-in-law, who also had Alzheimer's disease. He remembered the burden of caregiving for his wife and the disruption of their family when his mother-in-law lived with them for 2 years. At that time, his mother-in-law's many behaviors were not understood to be expressions of unmet need. When Sarah was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, Bill did not realize how much had changed in best practices to support people with dementia. He also had no idea that there were so many options available to support people with dementia and their families. With his mother-in-law, there had been no support groups, brochures, guidelines, or websites. The only option to providing total care for his mother-in-law was the nursing home. Bill assumed many new roles. During their marriage, Sarah had done most of the household chores, and as her disease progressed, Bill had to take on these responsibilities while maintaining most of his own. He also needed to learn to relate to Sarah in new ways. The transition from daughter to caregiver of a person with dementia was particularly difficult for Sally. You may remember that when we first met Dennis's daughter in Module 5, she was overwhelmed and unprepared to be a caregiver. She had no awareness about the disease or how it affected her father. She attributed his inability to work a new microwave or manage his own medications or to realize how late he was calling her to being spoiled by her mother. As the option counselor gained the trust of Dennis's daughters, she encouraged them to learn more about dementia, connecting them with local Alzheimer's and dementia support groups. She was also explained why Dennis was responding the way he did. Lola, Dennis's other daughter, took on the role of researching and learning as much as she could. She shared this information with Sally, who, over time, came to understand the disease better. As a result, Sally's relationship with both Dennis and her sister improved. Sally also worried a lot about what would happen to her father and to the family as a whole. These worries were also behind the great frustration she experienced and expressed to the option counselor in their first meeting. The option counselor provided the information she needed about dementia and ways to support Dennis and herself. She also worked with a family to identify and define their new roles as caregiver. Although Dennis remains her parent, as his disease progresses, she will learn to relate to him in new ways. People with dementia are at elevated risk for depression throughout the progression of their disease, from the very beginning through toward the end of life. The risk for depression in people with dementia is high in part because of the threats to one's identity. This may happen, for example, when someone has to give up the car keys, quit working, or no longer do the things they have always been good at. Like dementia, the onset of depression occurs over weeks and months. Depression and dementia are often confused. When both are present, one condition may go unnoticed because depression will mask dementia and dementia will mask depression. Depression can stem from many causes. It is sometimes more prevalent in some families than in others. Some of these causes include the biochemical changes in the brain. Sometimes these are triggered by prescription over-the-counter drugs. Some illnesses, such as heart disease and dementia, are associated with depression. Vision and hearing changes can lead to isolation and therefore to depression. Stress is another cause. This might be the stress of living in an environment that is increasingly complex and confusing, or it can be stress of caregiving. Living in the Northwest, we know that some people experience depression in the winter months, especially when it is wet and dreary. People with a prior history of major depression have a higher risk of developing dementia in later life, and people with dementia have an elevated risk for depression, regardless of their history of depression. Many symptoms are associated with depression. As I list some of the common symptoms, think about which of these are similar to those of dementia. Common symptoms include loss of interest or pleasure in activities, a depressed mood, sadness, feelings of emptiness, feeling slowed down or restless, self-neglect, impaired attention, impaired information processing, feeling worthless or guilty, thoughts of death or suicide, increase or decrease in appetite, trouble sleeping or sleeping too much, loss of energy, fatigue, and problems thinking, making decisions, and concentrating. Symptoms that are common to both dementia and depression are loss of interest and pleasure in activities, self-neglect, impaired attention, impaired information processing, and problems with thinking, concentrating, or making decisions. Throughout this training, we have stressed the importance of getting a thorough and complete physical and psychological and cognitive exam. This is especially important in situations where there may be both depression and dementia. Sometimes dementia symptoms can be reversed when a major depression is treated. You may remember that in the modules on person-centered decision support that Sarah had been treated for depression. Recall that the options counselor described Sarah's families as smothering her. This was a good example of excess safety in the early stages of the disease that contributed to Sarah's depression. Here's how Sarah describes that time.
After the kids were grown and my mother died, I became a full-time volunteer. I loved it. I used to play in a community orchestra and I even helped them with fundraising. I volunteered 3 mornings a week at the hospital gift shop, and I drove 2 days a week for Meals on Wheels. And then when Bill would be reading or watching TV, I made doll furniture. Most of this was donated for various fundraisers. I noticed that some things were not quite right. Well, first it got really hard learning music, and that should have been easy. And then I had trouble making change at the gift shop. I really knew something was wrong when I got lost trying to deliver meals. I had had that route for years, and even though the people changed, the neighborhoods didn't. I think Bill noticed some things too. The doctor did some tests and told me I likely had Alzheimer's disease. It was horrible. I kept seeing my mother in that nursing home and remembered how exhausted I was caring for her. I was so frightened. Bill was great, but he was never the one who took care of the kids when they were sick, and he did do some housework when my mother lived with us, but he just couldn't help me take care of her. I kept thinking of all that I was going to miss. My grandchildren were babies. I'd never know them when they grew up. Bill's health isn't all that great, and I didn't know how he was going to manage. I told him to put me in a home, but he wouldn't hear of it. I just really got down in the dumps. I didn't want to do anything, and Bill hovered over me until I thought I would scream. And then I broke my foot. The hospital was horrible. It was so confusing. I was grateful for Bill's hovering then. After I got home, a nurse came to the house and she asked a bunch of questions about how I was feeling. She talked to Bill, and then we went to the doctor for my foot, and he asked me those same questions and a bunch more. They had nothing to do with my foot. Anyway, he told us he thought I was depressed and prescribed some medicine. About a month later, I realized that I was feeling a lot more hopeful, and some of my forgetfulness was probably because of the depression. I found there was still a lot I could do.
Note that Sarah's memory improved following treatment. Depression in a person with dementia is treatable. In addition to the medication that Sarah received for her depression, the person-centered plan that she and her family developed with the assistance of the options counselor also helped her maintain her identity as a contributing member of her family and community. This was critical in preventing a recurrence of depression. As we saw in Module 6, she was a full participant in planning for her care, and she continued to pursue her interests successfully for a long time. As Sarah declined, she could no longer work at the gift shop. Bill enrolled her in an adult day program where she would work on crafts and socialize with others, thereby meeting her needs for creativity and Bill's needs for respite. Sarah is not the only one at risk of depression. Over a quarter of family caregivers suffer from depression. Because she was diagnosed prior to her 65th birthday, Sarah is one of the 5% of those with dementia with younger onset Alzheimer's disease. While many caregivers of those with dementia may be at increased risk for depression and feelings of burden, these risks seem to be particularly high for those with younger onset dementia. These families face more years of caregiving, and the disease interrupts many developmental tasks of middle and early old age. Over half of these caregivers experience mild to severe depression. Caregiving spouses may be at more risk of experiencing loneliness. Caregiving can be very isolating as dependency grows and the relationship with the person with dementia changes. They may no longer remember shared life events or be able to engage in the same types of conversations or activities that define them as a couple. Early transitions experienced by families will include changing roles to include increasing oversight and monitoring of the person with dementia, making the environment supportive and safe, and perhaps engaging outside assistance. This role shift, a term I much prefer to that of role reversal, is often quite difficult and painful for family members as well as the person with dementia. Bill and Sarah are lucky that Sarah received a diagnosis early. This helped them to be more proactive in their planning. Their children were supportive, so they avoided high levels of conflict found in many families. This might be because their children were adults themselves. In many families where there is onset of dementia at an early age, children are still living at home and trying to navigate adolescence and young adulthood. Because Sarah was in her early 60s, most aging services were available to her. Those younger than 60 often have great difficulty accessing services. A major stress for Bill, however, is that he retired much sooner than he expected or wanted. Work was a central role for Bill, and he was good at it. This was the way he contributed to the community and to his family. His early retirement not only affected their current financial situation, but the decision could negatively impact Bill's identity as a provider, and it puts him at risk financially as he ages.